Section 1 of Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Monsters of Mars by Edmond Hamilton. Part 1. Alan Randall stared at the man before him. "And that's why you sent for me, Milton?" he finally asked. There was a moment's silence, in which Randall's eyes moved as though uncomprehendingly from the face of Milton to those of the two men beside him. The four sat together at the end of a roughly furnished and electric-lit living room, and in that momentary silence there came into them from the outside night the distant pounding of the Atlantic upon the beach. It was Randall who first spoke again. The other's face was unsmiling. "That's why I sent for you, Alan," he said quietly. "To go to Mars with us tonight." "To Mars?" he repeated. "Have you gone crazy, Milton, or is this some joke you've put up with Longyear and Nelson here?" Milton shook his head gravely. "It's not a joke, Alan. Longyear and I are actually going to flash out over the Gulf to the planet Mars tonight. Nelson must stay here, and since we wanted three to go, I wired you as the most likely of my friends to make the venture." "But good God!" Randall exploded, rising. "You, Milton, as a physicist, ought to know better. Spaceships and projectiles and all that are but fictionist dreams." "We are not going in either spaceship or projectile," said Milton calmly. And then, as he saw his friend's bewilderment, he rose and led the way to a door at the room's end, the other three following him into the room beyond. It was a long laboratory of unusual size in which Randall found himself, one in which every variety of physical and electrical apparatus seemed represented. Three huge dynamo motor arrangements took up the room's far end, and from them a tangle of wiring led through square black condensers and transformers to a battery of great tubes. Most remarkable, though, was the object at the room's center. It was like a great double cube of dull metal, being in effect two metal cubes, each 12 feet square, supported a few feet above the floor by insulated standards. One side of each cube was open, exposing the hollow interiors of the two cubical chambers. Other wiring led from the big electronic tubes and from the dynamos to the sides of the two cubes. The four men gazed at the enigmatic thing for a time in silence. Milton's strong, capable face showed only in its steady eyes what feelings were his, but Lanier's younger countenance was alight with excitement, and so too, to some degree, was that of Nelson. Randall simply stared at the thing until Milton nodded towards it. "That," he said, "is what will flash us out to Mars tonight." Randall could only turn his stare upon the other, and Lanier chuckled. "Can't take it in yet, Randall? Well, neither could I, when the idea was first sprung on us." Milton nodded to seats behind them, and as the half-dazed Randall sank into one, the physicist faced him earnestly. "Randall, there isn't much time now, but I'm going to tell you what I've been doing in the last 2 years on this God-forsaken Maine coast. I have been for those 2 years in unbroken communication by radio with beings on the planet Mars. It was when I still held my physics professorship back at the university that I first got onto the track of the thing. I was studying the variation of static vibrations, and in so doing caught steady signals, not static, at an unprecedentedly high wavelength. They were dots and dashes of varying length, in an entirely unintelligible code, the same arrangement of them being sent out apparently every few hours. I began to study them, and soon ascertained that they could be sent out by no station on Earth. The signals seemed to be growing louder each day, and it suddenly occurred to me that Mars was approaching opposition with Earth. I was startled, and kept careful watch. On the day that Mars was closest to the Earth, that was when the signals were loudest. Thereafter, as the red planet receded, they grew weaker. The signals were from some being or beings on Mars. At first I was going to give the news to the world, but saw in time that I could not. There was not sufficient proof, and a premature statement would only wreck my own scientific reputation. So I decided to study the signals farther until I had irrefutable proof, and to answer them if possible. I came up here and had this place built, and the aerial towers and the other equipment I wanted set up. Lanier and Nelson came with me from the university, and we began our work. Our chief object was to answer those signals, but it proved heartbreaking work at first. We could not produce a radio wave of great enough length to pierce out through the Earth's insulating layer and across the Gulf to Mars. We used all the power of our great windmill dynamo hookups, but for long could not make it. Every few hours, like clockwork, the Martian signals came through. Then at last we heard them repeating one of our own signals. We had been heard! For a time we hardly left our instruments. We began the slow and almost impossible work of establishing intelligent communication with the Martians. It was with numbers we began. Earth is the third planet from the Sun, and Mars the fourth. So 3 represented Earth, and 4 stood for Mars. Slowly we felt our way to an exchange of ideas, and within months were in steady and intelligent communication with them. They asked us first concerning Earth, its climates and seas and continents, and concerning ourselves, our races and mechanisms and weapons. Much information we flashed out to them, the language of our communication being English, the elements of which they had learned, with a mixture of numbers and symbolic dot-dash signals. We were as eager to learn about them. They were somewhat reticent, we found, concerning their planet and themselves. They admitted that their world was a dying one, and that their great canals were to make life possible on it, and also admitted that they were different in bodily form from ourselves. They told us finally that communication like this was too ineffective to give us a clear picture of their world, or vice versa. If we could visit Mars, and then they visit Earth, both worlds would benefit by the knowledge of the other. It seemed impossible to me, though I was eager enough for it. But the Martians said that while spaceships and the like were impossible, there was a way by which living beings could flash from Earth to Mars and back by radio waves, even as our signals flashed. Randall broke in amazement. "By radio?" he exclaimed, and Milton nodded. Yes, so they said, nor did the idea of sending matter by radio seem too insane after all. We send sound, music by radio waves across half the world from our broadcasting stations. We send light, pictures, across the world from our television stations. We do that by changing the wavelength of the light vibrations to make them radio vibrations, flashing them out thus over the world to receivers which alter their wavelengths again and change them back into light vibrations. Why then could not matter be sent in the same way? Matter, it has been long believed, is but another vibration of the ether, like light and radiant heat and radio vibrations and the like, having a lower wavelength than any of the others. Suppose we take matter and by applying electrical force to it change its wavelength, step it up to the wavelength of radio vibrations. Then those vibrations can be flashed forth from the sending station to a special receiver that will step them down again from radio vibrations to matter vibrations. Thus matter, living or non-living, could be flashed tremendous distances in a second. This the Martians told us, and said they would set up a matter transmitter and receiver on Mars, and would aid and instruct us so that we could set up a similar transmitter and receiver here. Then part of us could be flashed out to Mars as radio vibrations by the transmitter, and in moments would have flashed across the Gulf to the red planet, and would be transformed back from radio vibrations to matter vibrations by the receiver awaiting us there. Naturally we agreed enthusiastically to build such a matter transmitter and receiver, and then, with their instructions signaled to us constantly, started the work. Weeks it took, but at last, only yesterday, we finished it. The thing's 2 cubical chambers are one for the transmitting of matter and the other for its reception. At a time agreed on yesterday, we tested the thing, placing a guinea pig in the transmitting chamber and turning on the actuating force. Instantly the animal vanished, and in moments came a signal from the Martians saying that they had received it unharmed in their receiving chamber. Then we tested it the other way, they sending the same guinea pig to us, and in moments it flashed into being in our receiving chamber. Of course, the step-down force in the receiving chamber had to be in operation, since had it not been, at that moment the radio vibrations of the animals would have simply flashed on endlessly in endless space. And the same would happen to any of us where we flashed forth and no receiving chamber turned on to receive us. We signaled the Martians that all tests were satisfactory, and told them that on the next night at exactly midnight by our time we would flash out ourselves on our first visit to them. They have promised to have their receiving chamber operating to receive us at that moment, of course, and it is my plan to stay there 24 hours, gathering ample proofs of our visit, and then flash back to Earth. Nelson must stay here, not only to flash us forth tonight, but above all to have the receiving chamber operating to receive us at the destined moment 24 hours later. The force required to operate it is too great to use for more than a few minutes at a time, so it is necessary above all that the force be turned on and the receiving chamber ready for us at the moment we flash back. And since Nelson must stay, and Lanny and I wanted another, we wired you, Randall, in the hope that you would want to go with us on this venture. And do you?" As Milton's question hung, Randall drew a long breath. His eyes were on the two great cubical chambers, and his brain seemed whirling at what he had heard. Then he was on his feet with the others. "Go? Could you keep me from going? Why, man, it's the greatest adventure in history!" Milton grasped his hand, as did Lanier, and then the physicist shot a glance at the square clock on the wall. "Well, there's little enough time for us left," he said, "for we've hardly an hour before midnight, and at midnight we must be in that transmitting chamber for Nelson to send us flashing out." Randall could never recall but dimly afterward how that tense hour passed. It was an hour in which Milton and Nelson went with anxious faces and low-voiced comments from one to another of the pieces of the apparatus in the room, inspecting each carefully, from the great dynamos to the transmitting and receiving chambers, while Lanier quickly got out and made ready the rough khaki suits and equipment they were to take. It lacked but a quarter of an hour of midnight when they had finally donned those suits, each making sure that he was in possession of the small personal kit Milton had designated. This included for each a heavy automatic, a small supply of concentrated foods, and a small case of drugs chosen to counteract the rarer atmosphere and lesser gravity which Milton had warned to expect on the Red Planet. Each also had a strong wristwatch, the three synchronized exactly with the big laboratory clock. When they had finished checking up on this equipment, the clock's longer hand pointed almost exactly to the 12 figure, and the physicist gestured expressively towards the transmitting chamber. Lanier, though, strode for a moment to one of the laboratory's doors and flung it open. As Randall gazed out with him, they could see far out over the tossing sea, dimly lit by the great canopy of the summer stars overhead. Right at the zenith among those stars shone brightest a crimson spark. "Mars!" said Lanier, his voice a half whisper. "And they're waiting out there for us now. Out there where we'll be in minutes." "And if they shouldn't be waiting, their receiver chambers not ready?" But Milton's calm voice came across the room to them. "0 hour," he said, stepping up into the big transmitting chamber. Lanier and Randall slowly followed, and despite himself a slight shudder shook the latter's body as he stepped into the mechanism that in moments would send him flashing out through the great void as impalpable ether vibrations. Milton and Lanier were standing silent beside him, their eyes on Nelson, who stood watchfully now at the big switchboard beside the chambers, his own gaze on the clock. They saw him touch a stud, and another, and the hum of the great dynamos at the room's end grew loud as the swarming of angry bees. The clock's longer hand was crawling over the last space to cover the smaller hand. Nelson turned a knob, and the battery of great glass tubes broke into brilliant white light, a crackling coming across them. Randall saw the clock's pointer clicking over the last divisions, and as he saw Nelson grip a great switch there came over him a wild impulse to bolt from the transmitting chamber. But then, as his thoughts whirled maelstrom-like, there came a clang from the clock, and Nelson flung down the switch in his grasp. Blinding light seemed to break from all the chamber onto the three. Randall felt himself hurled into nothingness by forces titanic, inconceivable, and then knew no more. Randall came back to consciousness with a humming sound in his ears and with a sharp pain piercing his lungs at every breath. He felt himself lying on a smooth, hard surface, and heard the humming stop and be succeeded by a complete silence. He opened his eyes, drawing himself to his feet as Milton and Lanier were doing, and stared about him. He was standing with his two friends inside a cubical metal chamber, almost exactly the same as the one they had occupied in Milton's laboratory a few moments before. but it was not the same as their first astounded glance out through its open side told them. For it was not the laboratory that lay around them, but a vast cone-like hall that seemed to Randall's dazed eyes of dimensions illimitable. Its dull gleaming metal walls slanted up for 1,000 feet over their heads, and through a round aperture at the tip far above and through great doors in the walls came a thin sunlight. At the center of the great hall's circular floor stood the 2 cubical chambers, in one of which the 3 were, while around the chambers were grouped masses of unfamiliar-looking apparatus. To Randall's untrained eyes it seemed electrical apparatus of very strange design, but neither he nor Milton nor Lanier paid it but small attention in that first breathless moment. They were gazing in fascinated horror at the scores of creatures who stood silent amid the apparatus and its switches, gazing back at them. Those creatures were erect and roughly manlike in shape, but they were not human men. They were, the thought blasted to Randall's brain in that horror-filled moment, crocodile men. Crocodile men! It was only so that he could think of them in that moment, for they were terribly like great crocodile shapes that had learned in some way to carry themselves erect upon their hinder limbs. The bodies were not covered with skin, but with green bony plates. The limbs, thick and taloned at the paw ends, seemed greater in size and stronger, the upper 2 great arms and the lower 2 the legs upon which each walked, while there was but the suggestion of a tail. But the flat head, set on the neckless body, was most crocodilian of all, with great fanged, hinged jaws projecting forward, and with dark unwinking eyes set back in bony sockets. Each of the creatures wore on his torso a gleaming garment, like a coat of metal scales, with metal belts in which some had shining tubes. They were standing in groups here and there about the mechanisms, the nearest group at a strange big switch panel not a half-dozen feet from the 3 men. Milton and Lanier and Randall returned in a tense silence the unwinking stare of the monstrous beings around them. "The Martians!" Lanier's horror-filled exclamation was echoed in the next instant by Randall's. "The Martians! God, Milton, they're not like anything we know. They're reptilian!" Milton's hand clutched his shoulder. "Steady, Randall," he muttered. "They're terrible enough, God knows, but remember we must seem just as grotesque to them." The sound of their voices seemed to break the great hall's spell of silence, and they saw the crocodilian Martians before them, turning and speaking swiftly to each other in low hissing speech sounds that were quite unintelligible to the 3. Then, from the small group nearest them, one came forward, until he stood just outside the chamber in which they were. Randall felt dimly the momentousness of the moment in which beings of Earth and Mars were confronting each other for the first time in the solar system's history. The creature before them opened his great jaws and uttered slowly a succession of sounds that for the moment puzzled them, so different were they from the hissing speech of the others, though with the same sibilance of tone. Again the thing repeated the sounds, and this time Milton uttered an exclamation. "He's speaking to us!" he cried. "Trying to speak the English that I taught them in our communication! I caught a word! Listen!" As the creature repeated the sounds, Randall and Lanier started to hear also, vaguely expressed in that hissing voice, familiar words. "You are Milton and others from Earth?" Milton spoke very clearly and slowly to the creature. "We are those from Earth," he said. "And you are the Martians with whom we have communicated?" "We are those Martians," said the other's hissing voice slowly. "These," he waved a taloned paw towards those behind him, "have charge of the matter transmitter and receiver. I am of our ruler's council." "Ruler?" Milton repeated. "A ruler of all Mars?" "Of all Mars," the other said. "Our name for him would mean in your words, the Martian Master. I am to take you to him." End of Part 1 of Monsters of Mars, read by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand.